Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Arthur Brandwood, and welcome to this month's Brandwood Live webinar, where we'll be talking today about active vigilance. I call it active vigilance because there's a number of changes taking place. The new European medical device regulations are coming in. We have a new ISO 13485 standard, and we have new expectations for clinical evidence, all of which require us to be active. It's no longer acceptable to simply keep an eye on complaint files and see what comes through the door and report something if you have to. There's a new world coming where you actually have to be active and monitor your devices in the post-market space. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that today. We're going to look at the new regulations, we're going to look at what the new standard says, and we're going to look at a particular guidance about clinical evaluation. Just a little bit about Brandwood Biomedical, and before we start, I promise it's only one slide. We are a regulatory quality and reimbursement service firm. We do medical devices and IVDs, and we cover everything from due diligence and strategy all the way through regulatory implementation, preparing technical dossiers, technical advice on things like biocompatibility and clinical evaluation, filing regulatory submissions, licensing, holding, and of course post-market compliance, which is the subject of today's webinar. We have our headquarters here in Sydney, a small office in New Zealand, and an office in Beijing, China, as well as a network of close partners who we trust and are prepared to stand behind, and we actually monitor through our ISO 9001 quality system. So we have a particular focus on the Asia Pacific. We bring to what we do a bit of a global perspective. You have to do that these days. That as global industry, regulations are gradually harmonizing globally, although some might think we're going backwards a little bit at the moment, but they are harmonizing globally. And we are particularly keen to be highly networked and highly engaged. What do I mean by that? To do regulatory affairs, you have to work with your industry, you have to work with the regulatory agencies. So as a firm, we spend a fair bit of time supporting industry associations through our national association, Biotech, MEDDEV here in Australia, and through supporting regulatory groups. So, for example, participating in the Asian Harmonization Working Party, where I act as a special advisor to the Working Group 1 on pre-market requirements. And we've delivered training to a number of regulatory agencies around the region, and that means that we've got a clear idea of what's going on, and allows us to work from a position of some trust and credibility. Enough about Brandwood Biomedical. Let's get on to the subject of today's webinar. So we're going to look at three particular documents, three requirements. We're going to look at the new international standard ISO 13485, the 2016 version. We're going to look at the draft version of the European Medical Device Regulations. It's available online. You can go to the Europa website and download it. And there's the front page of it there. It's actually in red line form. It's got all the edits in it. And we're also going to look at the MEDDEV 2.71 guidance on clinical evaluation. That's a very substantial guidance and has recently been revised, and we'll come back to that in a moment. That's a lot to take in, and yeah, you might well lose sleep having to deal with the requirements of all of these things, which are all changing at the same time. So let's start with one of them. Let's start with ISO 13485. This is a slide from a webinar I gave a few months ago, saying, yes, it's arrived. Well, it's arrived nearly a year ago now. We're a year into the transition. It was published this time last year, 1st of March 2016, with a 3-year transition period. So that by 2018, March 2018, everything's got to be under the new system. And certificates to the current 2003 version will not be valid after 2019. And Europe, of course, is harmonizing with an EN version of the standard. So I tell my students when I teach this at the university, there are three little words that make a difference in this standard. The original ISO 13485 was developed from ISO 9001. ISO 9001 is a quality system requirements standard, quality management systems requirements. ISO 13485 is for medical devices quality management systems requirements, with 3 extra words, for regulatory purposes, the complete change of emphasis. ISO 13485 is not so much about continuous improvement and the customer in that sense. It's about meeting the requirements of the primary stakeholder of the regulatory authority for regulatory purposes. However, in the 2016, we've added 3 more words: product safety and performance. It's like, I think what they did actually, they used the word processor and they went through the document, and where it used to say product quality, in the old version it now says product safety and performance. So the new version is very much about regulations and meeting those 2 requirements, product safety and performance, and there's a whole lot of references in the new version which speak directly to regulatory requirements, which is the big change. So what are the key changes? These are they. There's a whole range of them, and we're going to concentrate today. We're not going to talk about all of these things. We're going to talk about these 3. We're going to talk about that emphasis on regulations. We're going to talk about complaints and post-market, and a little bit about the risk management provisions in the standard, which are a little bit different this time round. So let's just think about the emphasis on regulatory requirements. The standard has a whole lot of stuff about objectives and documentation, but we're going to specifically focus on the last 2, which is post-market and the clause 8.5 on improvement. Post-market on requirements for reporting to regulatory authorities are now explicitly entered into the standard, and improvement now explicitly talks about continued safety and performance against the state of the art, not expressly put into the standard, but the concept is clearly there, and there's a lot of requirements on post-market surveillance. We're going to look at that. So let's just look at that in more detail. So clause 8.5.1 is improvement, and it says things like the manufacturer shall ensure continued medical device safety and performance. Continued. It's not sufficient to simply do a design exercise and come out with a validated and verified design. The standard now explicitly requires that this is a continuous whole of life cycle process. It was always there in the old version, but it's absolutely unavoidable now. You can't miss it. It includes specific requirements for post-market surveillance and embodies this concept of state of the art. For example, clause 8.2.1, and I apologize, we're going to have lots of quoting from the standards and documents in today's webinar. It's a bit wordy, but unfortunately sometimes you have to get in to understand the detail. The organization shall gather and monitor information. It's not a one-time job, it's monitoring. Feedback processes include data from post-production activities, meaning post-market. And you shall gain specific experience from the post-market and review it, and that's part of the whole feedback process. So it's saying quite explicitly it's incumbent on the manufacturer to monitor what's going on with the devices, review it, learn from it, and use it in feedback. The old complaints handling is still there. 8.2.2 complaint handling, so this was always there. Procedures for handling complaints, it now says in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. So there is an explicit reference there to things like the US FDA's medical device reporting scheme and the TGA's IRIS scheme and the European vigilance and reporting arrangements are all effectively referenced by that clause. And you are now required to expressly determine the need to report the information to the appropriate regulatory authorities. That's always been a regulatory requirement. It's buried well there in the US CFR, for example, that it's necessary for manufacturers to review post-market complaints and actively determine whether here you've got something that's reportable and to write down your justification for what you do. As I said before, analysis of data, clause 8.4 says analysis of data shall include data generated as a result of feedback. You're expected to analyze this. So You can see there, there's a number of different clauses in ISO 13485 where there's a change of emphasis. There's more than simply process. There's now active reference to regulations, to compliance with regulations, and to active monitoring of your medical device in the post-market framework. So let's now take a look at how that works in the new European regulations. As I said, the regulation is available on the Europa website, on the European Parliament website. The final text was agreed last year in June. It's now, it has been translated. It was discovered after it was translated, when that was checked, that there were a very large number of minor errors and discrepancies in the different translations, and that is being worked out and has further delayed the implementation of this regulation. The current estimate is that the medical device regulation is likely to be implemented in the first half of this year, so sometime in the next 4 months or so. The regulations have a lot more detail on post-market. They have a lot more detail on clinical. One of the big changes we've seen in the regulations, in fact, what's driven the whole process, is the expectation of better clinical evaluation of medical devices, particularly with a mind to avoiding failures of implantable medical devices, following some very high-profile cases where there were problems with implanted medical devices and questions about the adequacy of the clinical information that was gathered before they were placed on the market. And the European regulations, if nothing else, are driven towards better clinical evaluation, but they also have another component, and that is much more active post-market monitoring. So here's some of the changes. Now, it comes with a hazard warning. The text is not yet finalized. What you see on the Europa website still has the red line. The translations are being difficult. This is a lengthy document, hundreds of pages, and they're still ironing out all the details. So there may be minor changes, but I don't think anything's going to change in substance at this point. There's a whole bunch of things have changed. These are the key ones, and today we're not going to talk about all of this. We're going to focus specifically on these two, on the strengthening of clinical evaluation and on the post-market, and they are very much inextricably linked. So from the recitals, the preamble of the draft medical device regulation, Recital 51A says this. It says manufacturers should play an active role in post-market by systematically and actively gathering information from post-market experience in order to update the technical documentation. That is done through establishing a comprehensive post-market surveillance system set up in your quality management system and based on a plan, based on a post-market surveillance plan. It couldn't be any clearer. You've got to be active, it's got to be comprehensive, and it's got to be planned. And the result of that is that you use that information to update your technical file, update your risk assessment, and update your clinical evaluation. It's there in neon lights. You are expected to monitor what's going on with your device and continually update your technical file as you learn in the post-market phase. When do you have to update? Okay, particularly clinical files. And they're explicit about that as well. Whenever something that's unplanned, when you get new important information which may impact your existing evaluation, you learn something new. Typically that's if you get a series of adverse events or something where the device is behaving in a way that was not predicted. You're expected to monitor that, to evaluate what you learn, and if necessary update your clinical evaluation at the time that that information comes to hand. But it's not enough to say, well, nothing's happened, it's all fine, the original evaluation stands. The regulations now say you also have to do planned reviews for anything that's a significant risk or a novel device, and that means basically new technologies, all class 3 or active implantable medical devices, And Class 2B implants are generally the group thought of as significant risk devices and novel devices, any new technologies. For those devices, you will now be expected to actively update your clinical evaluation report at least annually. And for everything else, at least every 2 to 5 years. So it's now set there in the regulations. These are the expectations. The notified bodies are expected to check that you do this and to review the updated reports. And in fact, you are required to submit your new clinical evaluation report to the notified body for the higher risk devices. For the group that says annually, you have to send your report in for review every year. We're going to talk a bit more about that. There's a whole lot more reporting requirements in this new regulation. Post-market clinical follow-up is something you're going to hear a lot more about. PMCF, post-market clinical follow-up. It's mandatory in all of these cases. If you have an innovative device, new technology, if you make a significant change to a device in the design, you're expected to follow that up in the post-market phase to confirm that that significant change hasn't had any unexpected adverse effects. If there are particularly high product-related risks, if you have a high-risk device or a particular feature of the product which creates high risk, you're expected to follow up that device in the marketplace by looking at clinical performance. High-risk anatomical locations and target populations, think joint replacements, one likely example, are expected to be followed up. If you have new information on safety and performance, something you learn which suggests that there's something unexpected, some risks that were not foreseen, you need to follow it up. If your original clinical evaluation report was not based on direct clinical trial data, it was based on an equivalence argument, and a lot of clinical evaluations are done that way, where you don't do a direct clinical trial, but you create a report with a comparison to a predicate device and say, this predicate device is well established and my device is the same, therefore I don't need to do a clinical trial. Well, the regulations say that's fine, you can do that, but you must now follow that device in the post-market to confirm that indeed it is the same as the predicate, that it does perform adequately. And if there are unanswered questions on long-term safety and performance, again, that's something that's expected to be followed up in the post-market. So it may be that you think this device is going to perform, but there are some things which we just don't know about. So we don't know how it's going to perform in the, if it's a long-term implant, it's often difficult to conclusively answer questions about likely long-term performance, particularly on devices which may be implanted for many years, but have design life cycles measured in months or a year or two. Any of these apply, and they will apply in some way to most devices, then you're expected to do active post-market clinical follow-up. What does that mean, by the way? How do you do active post-market clinical follow-up? It could be, for example, running a registry. It could be doing a post-market clinical trial, or it could be not direct clinical evaluations in that sense, but you could have an active program of following up with your users, seeking their feedback, sending your product representatives out to engage with the users, and do that according to a plan and document it. Okay, so there needs to be an active evidence of post-market clinical follow-up, because believe you me, that's what the notified bodies will look for when they come around to audit. It is no longer enough to say, well, we've got a standard operating procedure for complaint handling, and if somebody calls up, this is what we do. You actually have to go out and find the information yourself. Just a word about innovative devices. They require active post-market clinical studies. So everybody wants to claim that theirs is an innovative device and should be given preferential regulatory treatment and so on. Be careful what you wish for, because in the European world, innovative medical devices are seen, rightly so in my opinion, as higher risk and therefore require active post-market clinical studies. And one thing the regulation explicitly says is that if you are an innovative device, then every patient should be captured in the post-market clinical follow-up. So you're expected to have some kind of actual post-market clinical study that captures all the new patients. So let's just summarize all of that. In the new medical device regulation, the clinical evaluation is certainly strengthened. We allowed to use an equivalence approach, of course. If you don't want to do a direct clinical trial, you can compare your device to a predicate. However, if you look at the detail of that, the requirements for doing that exercise are quite stringent, and you're expected to do it at a deep level. In other words, you are expected to be able to compare your clinical data directly to the clinical data of the predicate device. And if you don't have access to that, if it's a competitor's device, then you may not be able to get enough information to do a predicate evaluation. And we're seeing that in other places in the world as well. If you look at the new Decree 650 regulations in China, that's exactly what they do. The predicate path is available in China as well, where you can avoid a Chinese clinical trial by showing that you're equivalent to a predicate device. But in China, as is likely to be the case in Europe, you're needing to look at the primary clinical data. You need to have access to the records of clinical evaluation of the predicate device. And in most cases, that's not going to be possible unless it's directly your device. And the new device is a design iteration. There is a specific expectation on the expertise of the reviewers, and we'll come to that in a moment. I've talked about the updates required annually for higher risk things, or every 5 years at the most. For everything else, 2 to 5 years really. And we're going to come on in a moment to look at MEDDEV 2.7.1 and look out for continuing revisions of that document, and you'll see why in a moment. There's been a lot of changes in the clinical guidance in Europe. In post-market surveillance, active is the word. It's got to be active, it's got to be systematic, it's got to be lifetime, and it's got to be according to a plan. And there are burdensome additional reporting requirements now, which we'll also look at in a moment, and you're going to learn about post-market clinical follow-up. We've already talked about something called a periodic safety update report, and something called a summary of safety and clinical performance, an SSCP. These are new documents, new reports that are expected to be made by manufacturers periodically. So that's what's going on in the regulations. Now let's have a look at that clinical guidance. MEDDEV 2.7.1 has been around for a long time. It was revised recently in June of 2016 and is now a very substantial document, 65 pages of detailed guidance on how to do clinical evaluation for medical devices. And it's a guide both for manufacturers and notified bodies. That's kind of useful because, for example, it includes in there the specific guidance to the notified bodies on how to review a clinical evaluation report. So here's the trick. Make sure that you've read your clinical evaluation report, or you've written your clinical evaluation report against the guidance to notified bodies contained in 2.7.1, because there's the checklist. That's what they're going to look for. And if you can't find things that are on that checklist in your report, you know that they're going to find a fault with your clinical evaluation report. They're giving you the guide to their evaluation. Use it. So this guidance has been revised. Prior to June 2016, it was version 3, and it was written against the medical device directives and how to comply with the directives. Now we have 2.7.1 and we're in transition. We have 2.7.1 revision 4, we're in transition. It's still written against the medical device directives, but it may be applied in the case of manufacturers are complying to the new regulations as we transition. And next, we're expecting to see revision 5, which will explicitly provide guidance against the regulations. Look out for forthcoming revisions of 2.7.1. This is very much a living document, and it's going to change some more. Just some of the things. We don't have time to go through 65 pages of guidance, but these are some of the things that are in there. As I've already said, there is detailed notified body review guidance. It talks about the update frequency, at that annual for high risk, 2 to 5 years for everything else. It talks in detail about how to do equivalence, and equivalence is not just clinical equivalence. So you can write a clinical evaluation report to show clinical equivalence, but you can also demonstrate equivalence in terms of biological safety, in terms of physical performance. So here we have a merger coming together of the European regulations and the US regulations. The 510K process in the United States has been built on the concept of substantial equivalence for a very long time now, back since 1976, and here it is written into the European regulations. We now have a guidance here that says you can do clinical evaluation of a medical device, but you have to compare equivalence not just on the clinical performance, but you have to show that you're equivalent to the predicate device in terms of the technology, the physical performance and characteristics, and the biological safety, the biocompatibility. All of that has to be done, and it's in the guidance in detail. There's detailed guidance on how to document all of this, the need for plans, protocols, methods. It talks specifically about when you can use non-European data. There is a requirement in the new regulations that if you make comparisons to other devices, other data, those data should be developed on devices which are CE marked, unless you can show that the devices are effectively at a standard equivalent to a CE mark. In other words, they are approved in other markets. They are at an equivalent level. If the predicate data you're referring to is not gained on a CE device, then you have to justify that. It doesn't rule it out, but you have to justify it. And that's very much the same as you see in the US and you see in other markets. If international data have to be justified as applicable to the local circumstances. There are active periodic updates I've talked about according to the risk class, and clinical expertise. Here in Australia, the Australian TGA has for many years insisted that clinical evaluation reports were directly signed off by an appropriately qualified clinical professional. Somebody who is a clinical practitioner experienced in the particular device or in the field of medicine in which it's used, and would be expected to be competent to form judgments on the safety of that device and the performance of that device in clinical practice. Doesn't necessarily have to be a doctor. It can in some cases be another medical professional, a nurse, for example, if you're dealing with things which may be dealt with daily in nursing practice, such as dressing packs, for example, or a paramedic, if you're dealing with equipment that may be used in an ambulance, would perhaps be the most suitable person to comment on ambulance equipment, a portable incubator, something like that. A radiographer, if you're dealing with X-ray equipment. Clinical professionals who are experienced in the use of the device. That's what's been required in Australia for a long time. In Europe, the practice to date has been generally that clinical evaluation reports are often written by product specialists within the manufacturer. That's changing. The Europeans are now actually leapfrogging what's going on here in Australia, and they have a requirement now that there is an evaluation team that contributes to the clinical evidence report, and that you bring to the table a range of expertise. The clinical practitioner has to be there. In fact, they have to be the lead that signs off on the report. But you are also expected to have engineers, product specialists, statisticians, toxicologists, whoever is required to bring the appropriate panel of expertise. They've recognized that you can't do this with one person. You need a range of expertise, and that the clinical report needs to be contributed to by a team of people who are appropriately qualified. Literature searches and literature evaluations. The MEDDEV guidance provides detailed information on how to do that, including recommending sources for literature, which databases to use, and how to go about that. It's a very valuable source. And we also see levels of evidence coming in here. For those of you experienced in pharmaceutical regulation, the concept of levels of evidence is well known. The idea that all clinical data is not born equal, and that you have a sort of hierarchy. So at the top, randomized, controlled, double-blinded trials are seen as the gold standard. Non-randomized trials are not quite as good, and case series and individual case reports are seen as pretty low levels of evidence and not particularly reliable. That's very much codified, and many of the medical journals will now say what level of evidence is in an individual paper, but it's now something that's actively expected to be considered when you're doing your clinical evaluations, and you weight the papers that you read and you give them credence according to how strong the evidence is, what type of studies. And of course, there are not many double-blinded randomized controlled trials for medical devices, because it's difficult when you're dealing with a physical object to blind that fact from the patient and the user. Anyway, so that's what's in medical device guidance on clinical evaluation, and you can see there's a lot of detail there, and it's quite a different, quite a step up in expectations and detailed requirements. Updating clinical evaluations, there are a number of questions that are put in the guidance. Says, are your risk mitigations still appropriate given the current state of the art? Has the world changed? Has something better come along that now means that your device isn't as safe because there are risks associated with your device that are not present in new technologies? You may find that you have gone backwards because somebody's come along with a better mousetrap, and you have to expressly address that in your clinical evaluation. Are the risks appropriately addressed in your labeling instructions? Have you adequately addressed risks in the current post-market surveillance? Are you really following up that? So you can see you have to close the loop here, right from the risk assessment of the device at the beginning through to post-market. Are we still seeing things the same way? Are your claims still all right? Or are you changing your device, and most people are, and have you got new claims you might need to consider that mean you're going to need to update your clinical evaluation? You expand your claims, you're going to need to have clinical evidence for that, of course. Now, I talked about reports. The new regulations lay several more layers of bureaucracy on it. There are now a couple of other reports you need to learn about. A periodic safety update report and the summary of safety and clinical performance. These are new reports that must be written by the manufacturer and have to be sent off to the notified body. Periodic safety report. Article 60C of the new regulations say that for each device, or group or category of devices, kinds of devices, the manufacturers of everything except class 1, all devices which are actively regulated, have to prepare a periodic safety update report, and that summarizes all of your post-market data and the analysis, together with the rationale for why you did it the way you did it, and a description of any preventive and corrective actions that have had to be taken as a result of that review. And that has to be done throughout the lifetime of the device. It needs to look at the benefit and risk determination. You're going back to risk assessment. It needs to provide the main findings of the post-market clinical follow-up, and it needs to be set against the context of the sales history of the device. So this is a periodic report that has to go off to the notified body that says, this is how we actively followed up in the post-market, that says, this is what we found, and this is what it means, and this is how many devices we actually supplied. So it's set up so the incidences of failures, the incidences of events are set in context of the denominator of supply. And the summary of safety and clinical performance, Article 26 says, for class 3 and implants, other than custom-made or clinical trial devices, you have to write a summary of safety and clinical performance. It's got to be a sort of lay-term summary, which is clear to the intended user and if relevant to a patient, if it's something that's supplied directly over the counter to patients or whatever, and it's got to be published. It actually has to be filed annually through the new MEDDEV database, and if your device is an over-the-counter device or something that's provided directly to patients, your summary of safety and clinical performance is something that is going to be online and can be downloaded by your users. So it's basically a summary of the features of the device and its safety profile and its clinical behavior. Bit problematic, the MEDDEV database doesn't actually exist yet, so we're going to see some teething troubles in the transition into the new regulations, but this is going to be an expectation that you provide this summary for public consumption for your medical device. And you're expected to monitor it and to update it as you learn in the post-market. The summary of safety and clinical performance needs to have, by the way, these things in it. It needs to say who you are and what the device is, including its UDI number and its registration number on the UDIMED database. It needs to say what the intended purpose is and give the indications and contraindications and the populations for which it's intended to be used. You need to provide an overall description of the device, including the models, the previous generations, the variants, accessories, things like that. You need to set it in context of possible alternate diagnostic or therapeutic pathways, possible diagnostic or therapeutic alternatives. So if your device is one of several ways to treat a particular condition, including medicines, presumably, then you need to say, well, this is how this works and it's an alternate, and set it in context and the pros and cons of that. You need to say which standards you comply with, common specifications. Common specifications, for those of you not aware of them, are something that's set up in the new regulations that's to be written as a generic background requirement against what used to be called the essential principles, and now the safety and performance requirements. They are to be written. There will be some common specifications prepared, but they're not there yet. There's so much infrastructure yet to be put in place during this transition period. But you have to say which of those you comply with. You have to summarize your clinical evaluation and include relevant information on the post-market clinical follow-up. You need to provide user details of your device. In other words, the typical user, the user profile, and the training that may be required to use the device correctly. And then finally deal with residual risks through warnings and precautions. All of that has to go into the summary of safety and clinical performance, and that then ends up on the UDIMED database and published on the Commission website. Now, in terms of updates, they're explicit for these two reports. For Class 3 devices, active implants, and all other implants of Class 2B, those reports are expected to be updated annually. They will be assessed by the notified body annually in combination with updates to the clinical evaluation report. So you can see here there are now express requirements that every year you're going to formally update each of these reports and send them off to your notified body for them to assess them. For Class 2B devices as well, updated annually. Although they're not externally assessed necessarily, they'll be assessed at audit. And for 2A, every 2 years or more frequently if required, and maintained in technical file for audit on request. So a lot of new paperwork, a lot of active requirements to review and update and document those reviews. So this is all pretty daunting. There's new requirements for doing active post-market follow-up, for really understanding the clinical performance of your device, having plans for doing that, having processes in place, using appropriate expertise, and writing it all down and sending it off for somebody else to read and check. That's pretty daunting, but I'll just bring you all the way back full circle to ISO 13485 and point out clause 4.1.2 in there, which says that you apply a risk-based approach to process control. This is one of the big changes I referred to right at the beginning in ISO 13485-2016. Risk management has now been extended beyond product risk management to process risk management, and you are now expected to apply risk management approaches to the whole quality system, including, of course, post-market surveillance. So for lower risk devices, which are easily understood, it is legitimate to argue that you can take a risk-based approach and the depth of your follow-up may be adjusted according to how risky the device is. So it doesn't mean you have to do massive fully controlled clinical trials for tongue depressors. It's not what's being said here. What is being said is you have to be active, you have to think about what's necessary, apply risk management, do the appropriate monitoring, write it down, update it periodically, and have it reviewed when required. So, in summary, post-market vigilance needs to be planned, it needs to be active, You no longer sit by the phone and, have a procedure when somebody complains. You actually have to go out and find the information and show that you've got plans and processes for doing that. It needs to be reported. It needs to be written down in your own internal reports and reported to third parties for higher risk devices, and it needs to be risk-based. Finally, I just want to come to 2 slides from last month's webinar, just to remind you something. There's a lot going on. Here we have the timelines for the introduction of the new medical device regulations. You'll see at the bottom there the existing medical device directives still apply up into early 2020 and possibly a grace period beyond. At the same time, we're seeing notified bodies getting designated to the new regulations, and they're not going to be ready until well into 2019 to really start auditing against these new regulations. We have the new ISO 13485 standard transitioning over the next 3 years, so that by early 2019 everybody's going to be using the new version of the standard. And we have the single audit program as well going on in the background, where Canada are the first one to jump and require that you use that. All the notified bodies in Europe are being redesignated. Expected that the current sort of nearly 80 are going to be winnowed down. That many of those notified bodies will not survive. They will withdraw from the field because the standards and requirements being applied to notified bodies have considerably increased, and we're expecting to see 20 to 25, and they are going to be swamped. It's maybe only 3 or 4 of those will be designated to assess Class 3 devices. There's going to be a huge amount to do. Everybody's going to be overloaded, and so you need to think about these changes, these requirements that are coming in, the new reporting requirements, the new systems you're going to have in place, and be ready. Otherwise, you're going to find you're left behind. And particularly, last month's webinar was called a storm warning. In this period towards the end of next year, some say earlier, it's going to be crazy. There's so much going to be going on with all of those transitions happening over that 18-month period that getting the attention of a notified body even is going to be difficult. So do prepare for all of this and be ready for it. So thank you for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed it. You can follow us on our website, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, both the company and my personal page, and you can have a look at our YouTube channel. We'll send you a PDF afterwards of these slides so you can see those links directly. We do keep in touch and look out for each month the webinar. We send out a newsletter on the first Tuesday of every month. That's helpfully called First Tuesday in case you're like me and forgetful, so you know when it's coming out. And about the 3rd Wednesday or Thursday of the month, we do these webinars every month, so look out for them. Thanks for your attention, and now we might move to some questions. Randall May, Randy, welcome. Good to hear from you. Any news on when we can expect the MDR to be finalized? As I said, it's expected, it was hoped to be finalized before Christmas. They found out that there's massive errors in the translations. There were more than 1,000 inconsistencies and errors identified in the translation. This is a very lengthy document, and it's gone back to be checked and double checked and iron out all the inconsistencies, and whether that's going to throw up inconsistencies in the technical content, we're not sure, but that process is now said to be sometime in the first half of this year. So most people are expecting that the medical device regulations will actually appear before June, sometime in the next 2 to 4 months, and then we should kick off the 3-year transition period. And Sam says she's interested to know why notified bodies are insisting on MEDDEV 2.7.1, which is closer to the still unpublished regulations than the old directives, and even more why that insistence is based around the regulations itself. It's a good point, and I think the truth is what's happening here is that there are 2 changes taking place in Europe. One is the specific changes in the regulatory requirements applied to manufacturers, and that's all about strengthening post-market compliance and clinical evaluation. And secondly is the standard set for notified bodies. The primary criticism of the European regulatory framework over many years has been that it's too easy to become accredited as a notified body, and that the performance of notified bodies was too patchy, was too inconsistent, that you had the very good, very large notified bodies who were very rigorous, and you had many smaller notified bodies who were perhaps less so and who were less well supervised. Part of the whole European adventure was that every member state had its own competent authority, and they all wanted their own notified body, and frankly some were just not well enough resourced to do that, and so that led to a bit of forum shopping and of course to spectacular investigative reporting where people went round notified bodies, some of the weaker notified bodies, and tried to show that they would in fact approve faulty devices. A lot of questions about that, and therefore the other thing that's happening in the medical device regulations is a very substantial uptick in the supervision of notified bodies, and frankly the competent authorities are really taking no prisoners. They've raised the bar, they're setting the expectations high, and they're expecting notified bodies to apply guidances. And although the European system is based around harmonized standards that are voluntary, is based around guidance documentation, very much like in the United States, unless you can really very strongly justify a departure from any of that, then you better apply it. And the notified bodies are also similarly being policed and told, you have to do this, you have to apply these guidances, and they're getting ready for this. And they're saying politically it's not acceptable to do anything other than be rigorous on clinical evaluation, and that's really what's driving that, Sam, is that we've got the new guidance in place, they're preparing for the transition, and they're saying let's get on with it. It's not the most strictly correct legal and regulatory approach, I agree with you, but it's a political reality. Okay, so we have other questions here. Another one from Sam: should we expect specific guidance on new post-market requirements? I would expect so. I'm expecting to see a lot of new guidance documentation, but I don't know what explicitly is expected there. Taking a question from, let me just see. David asks, are high risk and significant changes adequately defined, or is there room for interpretation? That's the old chestnut. What is high risk? What is significant? They are not explicitly defined, but the way this has generally been interpreted is you need to look at that in terms of your risk management. You need to decide that if you're making a design or process change, do the risk assessment and come to a judgment there as to whether the change presents a significant shift in the safety profile of the device, and that's what's high risk. That's a hand-waving approach, I acknowledge. There are some particular circumstances, such as changes in high-risk device in class 3 or active implantable, where you make any sort of significant design change, are going to be considered high risk, things like that. But there is room for interpretation for sure, and you can bet that notified bodies are going to be conservative about those interpretations. Antje asks, can you please elaborate on a registry? What does it cover? Okay, let me explain. I referred to registries as one alternate way of doing, one way of doing post-market clinical follow-up. So for implantable devices, you can do a registry trial, and what that is essentially you monitor through post-market follow-up, through clinical follow-up, all patients who receive the device. Usually all-comers registries are the most effective ways of doing this. So you take the real-world population, you try to induct every single patient who receives that device into a registry trial where you collect information about the patient, the reason for putting in the device, and the specific data on which model was put in when, and you follow up that patient through time and look at the effectiveness of the device, whether there have been any adverse events or whatever. Well-known registries, independent registries, already exist for things like orthopedic devices. Here in Australia, we have the National Joint Replacement Registry. Similar registries have been around for even longer. In Scandinavia, there are registries like that in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in the United States, a whole lot of places where for every orthopedic implant that goes in, there's a return to the registry about this device went into this patient, implanted by this doctor in this hospital on this date, and this was the diagnosis and the reason for implanting it. The patient had osteoarthritis, and then if that device fails and has to be revised, there's another return, goes back, and you can plot survivorship curves and do all sorts of analysis. Those are sort of registries, but it's also possible for manufacturers to run their own registries on their own devices where they follow who receives the device, and we're expecting to see that for many more implants. And in fact, the recent review of the therapeutic goods regulation in Australia, the so-called expert review, one of the findings and one of the recommendations of that review is that all implantable devices should be subject to registry follow-up. It's a very nice recommendation to make. It's not quite simple as that, of course, because registries by their very nature are administratively complex and extremely expensive to run, so it's got to be paid for somewhere. And there are questions over governance, over access to information. Of course, you're dealing with clinical data, you're dealing with patient information, you're dealing with privacy considerations and so on. So all of that is necessarily complex. But I hope that answers your question, what a registry is. Akil asked, will we provide the slides after the presentation? Let me make it clear, yes. We actually are recording the presentation. We'll put that up on our YouTube channel, but everybody who's registered, whether they are actually viewing the webinar or not, will receive an email afterwards with a copy of the slides in PDF format, and I'll link to the recording, and we'll also provide a summary of these questions and answers. Rob says, I hear the use of the term state-of-the-art in both the medical device directives and the medical device regulations. What's a standardized definition of state-of-the-art for a device or a software, whatever? That's a very good question, Rob. The conventional answer to that question is a standardized definition. You don't realize the irony of what you said. You're closer than you think. It's essentially state-of-the-art is as reflected in current consensus standards. So ISO and European standards reflect the state-of-the-art. So if you have a product standard, that's considered to be the current state of the art. Now, those of you who've been involved in standards preparation will smile a little at that, because and I've been doing that for far too long. Consensus standards are just that. They are consensus, and by their nature tend to lag behind state of the art. So they reflect what's well established rather than what's cutting edge. So state of the art is what is currently established practice and safety profile and technical requirements for medical devices as reflected in the current body of standards, preferably in harmonized standards, but if there are non-harmonized standards, if there are well accepted industry standards or whatever, then that's also a reference point for state of the art. Antje asks another question, says, in regard to post-market clinical follow-up, in the case of a currently existing launch device which has been around for a number of years and with no clinically related complaints, will active post-market clinical follow-up be accepted as well? And the answer, quite simply in one word, yes. The whole point is, and a number of manufacturers found out to their cost, they said, well, this thing's been around for decades and we've never had a problem. But unless you've got active post-market follow-up in place, you don't know that you haven't, that there have been no problems. It could be that you simply have not been listening, that you've not been receiving the information. So you will be expected to have active follow-up. It doesn't mean a clinical trial, but it does mean follow-up. It may be that you're going out and surveying your users. You need to go and look at what's going on, maybe observe the use, but there have to be active arrangements to go and confirm that the performance is as expected and what's going on. Val points out that product safety update requirements should also be an input into the maintenance of the risk management file. Thank you, Val. You're absolutely right. There are a whole lot of closed loops here. The point is that in all of this active follow-up, you have to do something with the information. And where does it go? And the primary place that you start is risk management, because the risk management is the tool for closing the loop on everything here. Risk management is the primary, is one of the primary inputs into design control. Your product development starts with risk management, and product device design change starts with risk management. So the appropriate thing to do is, when you've gathered information in the post-market phase, the best way to manage that is to feed that information back into a reevaluation of product risk, and then take it from there in terms of required mitigations and changes in design to mitigate new risks. Let's look for so Karen says, how active is active? Do we have to question customers actively, or can we work with feedback from customers? I want to be clear, it's no longer sufficient to be passive. You can't just expect people to, act if somebody calls. You actually have to go out and engage with your users and seek the information yourself. It is not good enough to just have a 1-800 number on your website. There will be expectations that you're going out and actively looking and actively sampling the marketplace. As I said, it doesn't need to be a clinical trial, but you do need to do things for lower risk devices. You may do questionnaires, you may periodically call up key users. You can do it by sampling. You don't have to talk to all your users, but you do need to be active. Tarina says, will Britain still comply with the MDR even though we're no longer with the EU? My goodness, that's a very good question. Brexit, it's a thorny question. There's a blog on the website where I look at that in some detail. You might want to go and look at the blog on brandwoodbiomedical.com and search for Brexit on there. You'll see a discussion on what's likely to happen in England. As an Australian who grew up in England, it's something particularly close to my heart. I don't know, but I can say a couple of things. Firstly, if the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, then a couple of things will become apparent immediately. That is that notified bodies operating in domiciled in the United Kingdom may no longer be able to function as notified bodies unless they relocate their headquarters to somewhere within the Union, and I think that that's already actively happening for the larger UK notified bodies. That's a risk containment, that's what they're doing. It's not surprising. And the other thing that's really important for manufacturers to think about, especially manufacturers outside of Europe, if you've got a European authorized representative that's based in the United Kingdom, they may no longer be able to function as a European authorized representative once the United Kingdom leaves the Union. So again, authorized representatives need to relocate, or you need to find a new authorized representative that's got an office that's somewhere within the Union. Having said all of that, there are several examples of countries which are not within the European Union which have mutual recognition treaties of various kinds that allow them to use the CE marking system to take advantage of the European regulatory framework, and we may see negotiation of some arrangements for the United Kingdom, but don't assume it. Nothing is to be assumed in the current state of negotiation for Brexit. It's pretty chaotic, so I wouldn't rely on it. And the other interesting thing, of course, is going to be what happens to the MHRA, the Medical and Health Regulatory Agency in the United Kingdom has been one of the stalwart players in medical device regulation in Europe. It makes very extensive contributions to development of technical regulations, extensive contributions to reviews and is one of the leading players as a competent authority in supervising notified bodies. With Britain out of the Union, the MHRA will no longer be able to participate in the same way. It may be used as an external reference resource, but it will no longer be a key player, and that is going to be a loss to the Commission in terms of the technical resources available for medical device regulation. There are a whole bunch more questions here, but I'm going to take one more before we close up on the top of the hour. Naresh says, will there be an update to the ISO 14971 standard as a result of updates to 13485 and the regulations? Naresh, absolutely. In fact, I do believe that the project to revise 14971 is about to start or is underway in ISO. So yes, we're expecting to see that to be updated as well. There's about another dozen questions or so here. We will summarize the rest of the questions and send out a written summary. So you'll see that in the email you receive over the next day or two. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to give this webinar as usual. We've had a very large number of attendants this time, and look out for next month's webinar, which we'll be looking at Taiwan. We do a fair amount of work here on Taiwan, and expect to see some description of what's going on in Taiwan and the regulations there. A market which is active, a very substantial medical device market, and has its own regulatory authority, the Taiwan FDA, which has an interesting way of doing regulation that's both rigorous but also pragmatic, and takes active note of other international regulatory approvals to abridge some of the processes. Learn joining us, and goodbye for now.